Good morning. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson, and I lead the Coalition Against Workplace Discrimination. The coalition brings together human rights organizations, labor unions, and community groups from across the country. Together, we work to dismantle systemic discrimination in Canada's workplaces and to hold public institutions accountable for their actions. We have already exposed discrimination across the federal public service, including at the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Privy Council Office. Today, we turn our attention to Global Affairs Canada, the department that represents Canada on the world stage. It is responsible for defending human rights and advancing Canada's values abroad. But within its own walls, Global Affairs Canada has failed to uphold those same principles. Through our work, we have heard from a network of roughly 100 current and former employees who have experienced racism, discrimination, and harassment inside the department, and most of them, women. They came together to form an informal peer support group in 2021, and what they describe is not the misconduct of a few individuals, but it is a deeply rooted culture, one where discrimination and those who discriminate are promoted, and those who speak up are silenced. A culture that protects power instead of people. Inside Global Affairs, racism, discrimination, and harassment are not isolated, they are institutionalized. They shape who is given opportunity, who is denied it, and who is punished for speaking out. Black and racialized women have borne the brunt of this treatment. Ambassadors and senior leaders have been allowed to target, humiliate, and retaliate against employees with impunity. They are acts of systemic racism and abuse of authority that violate Canadian law and Canada's international obligations, including the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the International Labour Organization's Conventions on Equality and Decent Work. And it's happening both here in Ottawa and abroad, where diplomats are meant to be representing Canada on the world stage. Since this peer support group was formed, dozens of the group's participants have left the department due to slow or non-existent responses by their departments. Many have had to take sick leave to deal with the negative impact it has had on their physical and mental well-being. We know the acute stress as a result of incidents of harassment and discrimination can have a dramatic impact on an individual's ability to recover from illness. The group has sadly seen 2 of its participants pass away mid-career. You will now hear from 2 former employees of Global Affairs Canada who have had the courage to speak up publicly about what they've endured. Their stories are different, but they reveal a consistent pattern, a system that protects senior officials while punishing the people who report misconduct. The first is Medina Iturer. Medina served as an assistant to the Canadian ambassador at our mission in Kuwait. She was proud to represent Canada abroad until she became the target of sustained racial harassment and discrimination by the very ambassador she worked for. When she sought help, the department's Values and Ethics Committee dismissed her complaint as inadmissible without even interviewing the ambassador or others involved. While her complaint was buried, the ambassador was promoted. They tried to dismiss her as inexperienced, unfriendly, and unable to adapt. But the ministry's own investigation found the ambassador encouraged and tolerated intimidation and discriminatory practices, and yet did not make any recommendations to address these issues. Medina fought back, and with the support of a lawyer, so she had to go outside of the remits of the public service. With her lawyer, Courtney Betty, she challenged Global Affairs' decision in the federal court seeking a judicial review application. And the court ruled in her favor, finding that Global Affairs Canada, their process was unlawful and failed the principles of fairness. The court ordered a new investigation, and the results were damning. It confirmed that the ambassador had bullied, discriminated against, and failed to protect Medina and her family while representing Canada abroad. Despite these findings, there has been no apology, no accountability, and no justice for Medina. So she has to continue fighting. And while during that time, the ambassador was promoted again and again. And Medina's case is not an outlier. It's a window into how discrimination operates inside global affairs. It shows how the system protects those in power, even when the evidence is undeniable. So at this time, I would like to invite Medina to share a few words with you.
Thank you, Nicola. I will start in the name of God, the most glorious, the most merciful. Thank you all. This time, it's very crucial, very important for me. My name is Medina Ultre. I started at Global Affairs in 2005 as full-time employee. So I worked all the way up to get where I was when I was posted in the mission. Years ago, if I want to share my story, like not about my career, but the emotional toll of being invisible, even while I was representing Canada abroad. Years ago, I was posted to Kuwait. In fact, it was in 2018. It was an honor for me to represent Canada. I was so happy because I was chosen among a lot of candidates. And I said, okay, because of my skill, I get this position. And I was so hopeful to be there and do the job that I was sent. But instead, it was not an honor. I faced isolation. I was judged, excluded. This made me feel that I didn't belong there. And I asked myself, what did I do wrong? Why I'm facing this kind of treatment? The system around me worked for those with the right connection, background, or skin color, not for me. The impact ripped my husband and my kids also, my family. I was there to represent Canada, and I was representing Canada, but Canada did not represent me. I'm sharing this not for sympathy, but it's the truth. I just want to speak on the truth. Because of this is not only my history. This is not only my story. It's because it's a lot of people, among some I know, who are silenced, who are feeling the same and went through different but same hostile environment. The place I was toxic, and it was suffocating. I don't know how I went through 3 years over there. For that, I will say, alors je vous invite à réfléchir. Qu'est-ce que signifie de représenter un pays qui ne vous voit pas? Que révèle notre système quand ceux qui servent sont réduits en silence? Comment bâtir une culture à chaque voix compte, une culture où chaque voix compte, peu importe l'origine, la race et le parcours. Je suis toujours là. La preuve est que je suis là devant vous. Debout, je porte le poids qui a été fait et de ce qui n'a pas été fait. Faisons mieux. Voyons-nous, soutenons-nous. Merci.
Thank you, Medina. And I want to remind you that Medina only got to this stage, was only able to get this investigation because the Federal Court of Canada ordered it. But that was an expensive fight that most workers cannot afford. And despite these investigations, no action has been taken. I would now like to introduce Rosalind Muana, who is joining us virtually. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rosalind. She is a trilingual strategist who managed some of Canada's most sensitive files. And instead of recognition, she faced years of harassment from her director, Latifa Belmadi, an executive director in the Public Affairs branch of Global Affairs. And when Rosalind complained, the same values and ethics body, their investigator, mocked her, asking, "Don't you think that you should find some hobbies?" Her union told her, "Complaints don't work. It's always been like that." And when she went to the Canadian Human Rights Commission, they sent her back to the same abusive employer for justice. The toll was devastating. Rosalind's health collapsed under the stress, and she was forced to take sick leave. She was later forced to resign, losing her career and her future in the Foreign Service. Rosalind lost her health, her home, her financial stability, and her career. Meanwhile, the director was later promoted, despite being found guilty of 7 counts of harassment. I will now invite Rosalind, to share a few words.
Thank you, Nicholas. I am honored to be here for those who cannot, those too afraid to speak or too broken to stand. Like them, the impact on my health and my life was shattering. As a strategist for global affairs, the harassment I endured was devastating. My condition was so severe that my doctor wanted to hospitalize me and place my daughter in foster care. I'm a single mom. I was 38 years old and I was completely dysfunctional. When it was time to receive my medical benefits, my application was rejected despite reports from 3 different doctors. I learned that I had been sabotaged and had to go to court. I felt like I was being deprived of my right to exist. I spent years alone, wondering why all this shatter and injustice. I wanted to die. My daughter saved me. I wanted to save the future. I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic disorder. This was a living nightmare. I didn't recognize myself. I could barely speak. I couldn't function at all. My daughter suffered too. She was only 8 years old. My trauma disrupted her childhood. She felt abandoned. Eventually, I was forced to resign. I lost my career, my pension, my benefits, my home, my mind. There was no respect, no reintegration, and no support. I was silenced and completely cast out. Se sentir seul, sans aucun soutien, c'est dévastateur. Finding work was impossible. More discrimination. And years later, I'm still looking for work. I feel like I am starting from scratch. J'ai perdu ma carrière et j'ai l'impression de repartir de zéro. à l'âge de 52 ans. With Canadian education, training, and experience, not being recognized for my caliber is not only insulting, it is dehumanizing. I am Canadian, born and raised, parfaitement bilingue. Je suis internationale, la fille d'immigrante de la France et du Congo. I don't know where to go for a sense of belonging. Canada is my home. Dans un pays aussi divers que le Canada, il s'agirait donc d'une injustice inhumaine et incompréhensible. We cannot call ourselves a nation if prejudice destroys lives. Diversity is not just our strength, it is our responsibility. Le gouvernement du Canada a longtemps été considéré comme étant un des meilleurs employeurs du pays, avec une sécurité d'emploi qui surpasse la norme. Global Affairs Canada must ensure a safe workplace. Every claim of harassment or discrimination must be taken seriously with the goal of eliminating such damaging sabotage. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Rosalind, for sharing that with us. And in Rosalind's case, it took Canada's Integrity Commissioner, who in 2022 found that Global Affairs Canada had committed gross mismanagement by failing to protect employees, from the very same director that was mentioned earlier in Rosalind's situation. So you have heard the human costs from Medina and Rosalind, but there are so many more stories. Another current employee, Jessica Lumumba, served Canada faithfully in 3 different postings: Kuwait, Paris, and Nairobi. At each mission, she endured racial harassment and bullying from ambassadors. And when she sought help, the same Values and Ethics Committee dismissed her complaints, the evidence disappeared, and her union failed to act. And instead of accountability, the ambassadors who harmed her advanced in their careers. Jessica couldn't be with us today because she's on extended sick leave. She lives with PTSD, serious health conditions, and no financial stability. Her only offense was being a Black woman who dared to stand up to racism. The stories go on and on. Workers have shared experiencing denigrating and disrespectful comments about their country of origin, humiliating and ignorant questions about their background and professional experience, denied opportunities and screened out of competitions, despite being qualified. Complaints are dismissed without investigation. Ethics committees, it acts as a shield instead of a safeguard. And unions often don't represent their members. And I want to stress that most of the employees in the peer support group are racialized women, highly educated, multilingual professionals, left to fend for themselves in isolated missions abroad. And we are here speaking for them today because they cannot speak for themselves. They have been silenced, ignored, and often punished for speaking up. What we've seen at Global Affairs Canada and across too many public institutions is a system that blocks their rights at every turn. And effective remedy, when workers face discrimination, they have a right called effective remedy. And that means more than an apology, which many have never received in the first place. It means fair investigations, accountability for those responsible, and real structural change to prevent it from happening again. Under Canadian and international law, every worker who faces discrimination has the right to that effective remedy, to justice that works in practice and not just in policy. That's the standard Canada preaches abroad, and it must also be the standard we live by here at home. This is a crisis of leadership and accountability that has gone unchecked for far too long. We have come to this podium time after time after time, highlighting discrimination throughout the federal public service. The Government of Canada continues to acknowledge it. Yes, it is happening. Yes, we're working to address it, but nothing is changing for workers, and they continue to suffer in silence. It must end with action and reform. So we are calling on Minister Anand and the Government of Canada to take 3 immediate steps. First, establish a resolutions committee within Global Affairs Canada to review and resolve outstanding cases of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. This committee must include independent experts, worker representatives, and operate with full transparency to deliver justice to those who've been harmed. So we're talking about people who are trained to recognize and detect systemic discrimination, who understand conscious and unconscious bias, to look at this through those lenses. Second, to create an independent investigative body separate from the department to handle all complaints of racism, discrimination, and harassment. And we echo this sentiment across the federal public service. So the Government of Canada should establish an independent mechanisms from the department, from the core public service, from the separate employers in the public service to investigate racism, discrimination, and harassment. Because what we have seen over and over is that those departments that commit the harm, a branch of that department investigates that harm, and they often appear to be beholden to the management and don't want to put that department in a liability position. And that creates a significant systemic issue for workers in terms of getting redress. So we're calling on the Government of Canada to implement this measure to police and investigate racism and discrimination throughout the public service independently, that can report to the Parliament those findings, and workers can finally start getting redress. And that recommendation is very key, because discrimination is allowed to thrive in Canada's public service because there's zero deterrence. Canada boasts of a zero tolerance policy across its departments on racism and discrimination, but the reality is that that zero tolerance policy, it means absolutely nothing. Workers cannot seek justice from the same systems that failed to protect them. And finally, to implement the Employment Equity Act reforms. Since 2021, the government has undertaken a review of Canada's Employment Equity Act, and a task force led by Professor Adele Blackett has made 186 recommendations. After 3 years of consulting communities across Canada, and have provided these recommendations to the government since March 2023. Last year, the government committed to implementing those recommendations and still have not done so. It is our firm belief that those recommendations would go a long way in making discrimination the exception in the public service rather than the norm. So we're calling on the government to fulfill its commitment to modernize Canada's Employment Equity Act. And these, they are the basic steps needed to restore trust, integrity, and fairness in Canada's public institutions. We don't want to see any more reports and empty promises. We expect action. and we will continue exposing systemic failures across the government of Canada until it happens. Thank you. And we'll now take any questions.
Hi, Nicholas. I'm wondering what leverage does having a case like Medina's substantiated give you, knowing that your previous class action was rejected by the federal court?
Well, what I would say is that that class action is under appeal. It is presently at the Federal Court of Appeal, and it only reinforces what the judge said at the lower court, is that workers just like Medina face these systemic barriers. The court fully acknowledged that it is happening, but chose to turn away. So Medina's case is significant. Again, it's not the internal system that Medina got this far with. She had to go to the court because the internal system said that her case was inadmissible. So Medina's case reinforces why the court should be involved in these types of process, because the system is incapable of providing justice. It is incapable of being fair and transparent. And that's what the court documents show in Medina's judicial review. And I just want to stress this, that the committee failed to observe a principle of natural justice, procedural fairness, and other procedure that it was required to by law. And Medina's case is so powerful because many workers are stopped at the ethics committee stage. They don't have the means to fight. They don't have anyone backing them. Their unions have turned their backs away on them. In many cases, it's their very same colleagues who are union representatives who are also fearful of the system. So it is a significant problem, and Medina's case represents some hope through the courts, because that's where we see global affairs have now went back, and now suddenly they find discrimination. Now suddenly they find bullying. Now suddenly they find isolation. And it shows that there needs to be oversight. And that's what we believe the federal class action must do in systemic issues that's so broad and where the discrimination is deeply ingrained in all of the features of the institution.
Madame Becci, est-ce que c'est possible de nous expliquer en quoi le cas de Madame Iltiré s'inscrit dans l'importance du recours collectif alors que le recours collectif a été rejeté par la Cour?
En fait, je pense que ce qui est important de retenir ici, c'est que des cas comme Medina, des cas comme Roselyne continuent de se passer à un moment où est-ce qu'on est en train de parler. Et je crois que ce qui va être important pour nous, c'est de continuer à demander justice malgré le fait que le système ne reconnaît pas notre humanité, ne reconnaît pas nos réalités. Alors, le système l'a rejeté, mais nous, de notre côté, on va continuer à demander justice pour des gens comme elle, des gens comme moi, puis des gens qui continuent toujours en ce moment à vivre ces inégalités, à vivre ces discriminations. Puis à ces gens qui, comme on l'a entendu tout à l'heure, vont vivre avec les effets puis les conséquences de leur réalité pour peut-être même toute une vie.
Hi there. I was curious about how Global Affairs Canada specifically fits into what your group is raising. I mean, you've been talking about different departments and agencies. Is it a particularly severe issue at Global Affairs? Is it more about the internal process at Global Affairs, on top of the broader systemic issue?
Well, it is as bad at Global Affairs as we've found in other departments. What is deeply concerning is that Global Affairs has a mandate to defend human rights and it's violating those human rights. We've seen the same pattern at Global Affairs. There is a mechanism to report discrimination. That mechanism blocks it. Workers are silenced, and leaders who are, and while those workers are held back, the leaders advance. So it's clear in the case of Global Affairs that the Values and Ethics Committee have silenced many workers and prevented their cases from going forward. And I wonder if in those cases, if the court had intervened, if now Global Affairs would have found different findings for all those workers that it has turned away. So Global Affairs Canada, the workers that we've spoken to, their experiences are extremely heartbreaking. When you see the pain in their eyes and in their faces, it's a crisis at Global Affairs.
I'm curious about the internal reform at Global Affairs that they've been talking about. I'm sure you're aware of it. I'm wondering if any of what they've put on the table addresses the concerns. I mean, clearly it doesn't go to the extent that you want, but when they were looking at, fairness in how they allocate positions and how it should be less management heavy, is there anything in there that you feel speaks to these discrimination issues?
Well, it doesn't, and that's the challenge. We're not seeing deep-rooted reforms, simply band-aid solutions that pass over quickly with change of management. And that's why we're calling for deep-rooted. We need to get to the root of the problem and stop trying to find band-aid solutions that does not address these issues that have, these are decades-old systems and they want to bring in these temporary little solutions here and there. It's not going to work. We need reforms in the Employment Equity Act, which will create the policies for the government measures. And even when there are change in management, the legislation is still the governing body. So we need that continuity force in terms of the policy changes, and we need real, not the Band-Aid solution. It's not working. We still have workers here. We still have workers here. We still have workers who many are on sick leave, and Global Affairs just doesn't care. It's only bureaucracy, and hiding behind these systems, discriminating flagrantly and violently against racialized people.
What does it say to you that the federal court did have to intervene in Ms. Ilter's case with Global Affairs, that there was the need for that? What does that say to you about the system?
The fact that the federal court had to intervene and rule that Global Affairs action was unlawful, it speaks to the broken system. When it comes to racism, discrimination, and harassment, it demonstrates that the Government of Canada and Global Affairs is incapable of policing themselves, incapable of investigating themselves, and it reinforces what we've said all along, that there needs to be independent oversight over the bodies that discriminate against workers. There needs to be court oversight when the issues are so systemic and embedded in all of the institutions. So it really shows a broken system.
S'il vous plaît, Madame Becci, puisque vous êtes la représentante francophone, en quoi est-ce qu'on vit à Affaires mondiales Canada? Est-ce que vous pourriez envisager un recours juridique avec le recours collectif noir, mais avec ce qui se passe à Affaires mondiales Canada uniquement? Où on en est là-dessus? Est-ce qu'il y a des possibilités à ce niveau-là?
En fait, je peux pas vraiment commenter sur ce côté-là, mais ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que Affaires mondiales, c'est un département fédéral comme, par exemple, la Commission canadienne des droits de la personne ou d'autres départements fédéraux où est-ce que nos des gens racisés et ou noirs vivent des discriminations, vivent des harcèlements, vivent des violences au quotidien. Donc, je crois que à ce moment-ci, dans la conversation, ce que nous entendons, ça ne fait qu'ajouter aux preuves, puis au discours que nous avons depuis déjà plusieurs années. Écoutez, c'est une réalité, c'est un fléau dans notre pays. C'est une maladie dans notre pays. Il faut crever cet abcès. Il faut arrêter de protéger tous ces départements qui continuent à faire vivre ces violences aux Canadiennes puis aux Canadiens. Alors, en fait, c'est ce qu'on est en train de dire. C'est que ces expériences vont s'ajouter aux expériences puis aux voix que nous avons déjà mis de l'avant puis qu'on va continuer à mettre de l'avant.
And if I just want to add one last thing that I think is really critical. In Medina's case, it is not allegations of discrimination. It is findings of discrimination. The ambassador discriminated against her. I think that is critical. And we are 5 years in her fight now for justice. 5 years. And she's still inside of this system fighting for justice. So,
thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci, c'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.